The morning sun was barely creeping over the horizon, painting the sky in soft pinks and oranges, when a thunderous pounding on my front door jolted me out of my half-asleep daze. The noise was so loud it made my coffee cup rattle against the kitchen counter, sending a few drops of black liquid splashing onto the granite. I froze for a second, my brain sluggishly trying to process who could possibly be hammering on my door at 7 a.m. on a Saturday. I wasn't expecting anyone. No deliveries, no friends dropping by, no reason for anyone to be making such a racket. My first thought was that maybe it was an emergency, someone's house on fire, a lost dog, or even a neighbor needing help. But as I shuffled toward the door, still in my faded flannel pajama pants and a t-shirt that had seen better days, a sinking feeling settled in my gut. This wasn't going to be good. I cracked the door open, squinting against the early morning light, and there she was, Karen, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, standing on my porch like she owned the place. Her neon pink blazer was practically glowing in the dawn, a garish beacon of her authority, and she clutched her infamous clipboard to her chest like it was the Constitution itself. Flanking her were two HOA security guards, guys who looked like they'd watched one too many cop dramas and decided they were ready to play the part. Their cheap polyester uniforms were stretched tight over their bellies, and their mirrored sunglasses gave them an air of misplaced menace, like mall cops who'd gotten lost on their way to the food court. Karen's face was set in a smug, self-righteous scowl, her lips pursed so tightly they looked like they'd been sewn shut. She didn't bother with a greeting, didn't even pretend to be civil. Instead, she jabbed a manicured finger in my direction, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We've received multiple noise complaints about your property," she barked, her tone dripping with accusation. "We demand immediate access to your garage for an inspection." I blinked at her, my brain still foggy from sleep and the absurdity of the situation. Noise complaints? At 7 in the morning? I hadn't even turned on a light yet, let alone cranked up a stereo or started banging around in the garage. The most noise I'd made was the soft clink of my coffee spoon against the mug. I glanced past Karen, noticing a few neighbors peeking out from behind their curtains, their phones already in hand, ready to capture whatever drama was about to unfold. This was clearly the morning's entertainment, and they weren't about to miss it. I leaned casually against the doorframe, crossing my arms and forcing my face into the calmest smile I could muster. It was the kind of smile I knew would drive Karen up the wall, relaxed, unbothered, and just a little bit mocking. "I'm sorry, Karen," I said, keeping my voice steady and polite, "but you're not coming into my garage. It's private property." Her face turned a shade of red that clashed spectacularly with her blazer. For a moment, she looked like she was going to explode, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Karen wasn't used to being told no. In her world, she was the ultimate authority, the arbiter of every mailbox color, lawn ornament, and fence height in the neighborhood. Her word was law, and anyone who dared to question her was met with a flurry of violation notices and passive-aggressive emails. The security goons behind her shifted uncomfortably, their hands hovering near their utility belts as if they thought I might suddenly pull a weapon or make a run for it. I could practically see the gears turning in Karen's head, her imagination running wild with theories about what I might be hiding in that garage. Drugs? A chop shop? Maybe an illegal gambling ring? Her eyes narrowed, and I could tell she was already spinning a story in her mind, one where she was the hero who uncovered some grand conspiracy. The truth, of course, was something she could never have dreamed up, no matter how many episodes of CSI she binged. My garage wasn't just a place to park my car or store old Christmas decorations. It was a state-of-the-art recording studio, packed floor to ceiling with soundproof panels, encrypted communication systems, and specialized equipment designed for one purpose: capturing wiretap evidence for the FBI. I wasn't some hobbyist messing around with a podcast setup or a garage band. I was working with federal agents, running a covert operation right under the noses of my nosy neighbors. The equipment in there was so sensitive it could pick up a whisper from across the street, and every inch of the place was wired with security measures that would make Fort Knox look like a lemonade stand. Karen had no idea she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to take a swan dive into the biggest mistake of her life. I held her gaze, my smile never wavering, and watched as her frustration boiled over. She wasn't going to let this go. Karen didn't back down, not when she thought she had the upper hand. She scribbled something furiously on her clipboard, probably drafting the most scathing violation notice the HOA had ever seen. Her security goons muttered to each other, clearly unsure whether they were supposed to do something or just stand there looking tough. Behind them, the neighbor's curtains twitched again, and I caught the faint glow of a phone screen as someone started recording. This was turning into a full-blown spectacle, and I was the unwilling star of the show. "Fine," Karen snapped, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "If you won't cooperate, we'll find another way. You're hiding something, and I'm going to find out what it is." She spun on her heel, her blazer flapping dramatically, and stormed off my porch with her goons trailing behind her like obedient puppies. I watched through the peephole as she marched down the driveway, muttering to herself and gesturing wildly. The neighbor's curtains fluttered again, and I could almost hear the group chat lighting up with speculation. I closed the door and leaned against it, letting out a long, slow breath. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Karen was like a dog with a bone, and now that she'd caught the scent of a mystery, she was going to dig until she either found something or made a complete fool of herself. Knowing what I knew, I was betting on the latter. I shuffled back to the kitchen, picking up my coffee cup and taking a sip. It had gone cold, but I didn't care. My mind was already racing, thinking through the implications of Karen's little stunt. The garage was secure, locked down tighter than a bank vault, but that didn't mean I could afford to be careless. The FBI operation I was part of was delicate, months in the making, and the last thing we needed was some overzealous HOA president poking her nose where it didn't belong. I'd have to call Agent Ramirez later, give him a heads up about Karen's antics. He'd probably laugh, maybe even add it to the growing file of neighborhood absurdities we'd been dealing with. But for now, I needed to stay calm, keep my cover, and let Karen think she was in control. That was the best way to handle people like her, let them run full speed into their own traps. I glanced out the window, watching as Karen's pink blazer disappeared around the corner. The neighbors were still lurking, their phones no doubt buzzing with theories about what had just gone down. I could imagine the messages flying back and forth. Asterisk, what's he hiding in that garage? Why won't he let her in? Is he running some kind of secret operation? Asterisk, they weren't entirely wrong, but they were so far from the truth it was almost funny. I shook my head and turned away from the window, heading back to the kitchen to make a fresh pot of coffee. It was going to be a long day, and I had a feeling Karen's little crusade was just getting started. As I waited for the coffee maker to gurgle to life, I thought about how I'd ended up in this mess. I'd moved to this neighborhood a little over a year ago, looking for a quiet place to settle down after a hectic few years working freelance tech jobs. The houses were nice, the streets were clean, and the community seemed friendly enough, at least on the surface. But it didn't take long to realize that this place was Karen's personal fiefdom. She ruled the HOA with an iron fist, handing out fines for the smallest infractions, a mailbox that wasn't the approved shade of beige, a lawn that was half an inch too long, a car parked an inch too close to the curb. Most of the neighbors just went along with it, either too scared to fight back or too tired to care. I'd kept my head down, paid my dues, and avoided drawing attention to myself. The last thing I needed was Karen sniffing around while I was setting up the FBI's operation. The garage had been my project from the start. When I'd first heard the house, the realtor had pointed out the oversized garage as a selling point, perfect for a workshop, a home gym, or extra storage. I'd nodded politely, already knowing exactly what I'd use it for. The FBI had approached me a few months earlier, looking for someone with my particular skills set, a blend of audio engineering, cybersecurity, and a knack for staying under the radar. They needed a civilian contractor to run a covert recording studio, a place where they could process wiretap evidence without drawing attention. My house, tucked away in a sleepy suburban neighborhood, was the perfect cover. No one would suspect a thing, they'd said. And for the most part, they'd been right, until Karen decided to make me her personal project. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, staring out at the backyard. The grass was still damp with dew, and a few birds were chirping in the trees. It was a peaceful scene, completely at odds with the storm that was brewing. I knew Karen wouldn't let this go. She was too stubborn, too convinced of her own importance. She'd probably spend the rest of the day rallying her HOA minions, drafting official-sounding letters, and trying to dig up dirt on me. Let her try, I thought. The more she pushed, the deeper she'd dig her own grave. The FBI had my back, and the garage was untouchable. All I had to do was stay cool and let her self-destruct. I took another sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through my chest, and allowed myself a small chuckle. Karen thought she was the sheriff of this neighborhood, but she was about to learn that she'd just picked a fight with the wrong guy. The garage wasn't just a building, it was a fortress, a carefully constructed piece of a much larger puzzle. Every wire, every panel, every piece of equipment had been installed with precision, designed to keep the operation airtight. The soundproofing alone had cost a small fortune, ensuring that not even a whisper could escape those walls. The encryption on the communication systems was military-grade, and the security measures, cameras, motion sensors, silent alarms, were enough to make any would-be intruder regret stepping foot on my property. Karen didn't know it yet, but she was poking a bear that was already wide awake and ready to roar. I glanced at my phone, debating whether to text Agent Ramirez now or wait until later. He'd want to know about Karen's visit, but I figured it could wait until I had a better sense of what she was planning. For all I knew, she'd just send me a strongly worded letter and call it a day. But something told me that wasn't her style. Karen was the type to escalate, to double down when she felt challenged. I could already picture her storming into the next HOA meeting, waving her clipboard and demanding a full investigation into my suspicious activities. The thought made me laugh out loud. If only she knew how close she was to the truth and how far she was from being able to handle it. I got up and walked to the living room, peering out the front window again. The neighbors had mostly retreated back into their houses, but I could still see a few stragglers lingering on their porches, pretending to water their plants or check their mailboxes. They were waiting for round two, and I had a feeling they wouldn't be disappointed. Karen was nothing if not predictable. She'd probably spend the next few hours whipping the neighborhood into a frenzy, spreading rumors about my garage and rallying her loyal followers. I could already imagine the group chat blowing up with wild theories. Asterisk, he's running a meth lab. He's hiding stolen cars. He's got a secret bunker full of weapons. Asterisk, the truth was so much stranger and so much more dangerous that it almost felt like a letdown to keep it to myself. I sat down on the couch, propping my feet up on the coffee table, and let my mind wander. The garage wasn't just a job, it was a mission. The FBI had been tracking a major criminal network for years, piecing together evidence from wiretaps, informants, and undercover operations. My role was small but critical: process the audio, clean up the recordings, and make sure every word was crystal clear for the prosecutors. It was meticulous work, the kind that required patience and a sharp ear, but it was also deeply satisfying. Every file I sent off was another nail in the coffin of some very bad people. And the best part? No one in the neighborhood had a clue. To them, I was just the quiet guy who kept to himself, mowed his lawn on Sundays, and never caused any trouble. The perfect cover. But Karen was threatening to blow that cover wide open, not because she was smart, but because she was stubborn. Her obsession with control was her biggest weakness, and it was about to lead her straight into a trap she couldn't escape. I could already see the headlines: HOA president caught in federal sting after botched break-in. It would be the talk of the town, maybe even make national news. And I'd be right there, sipping my coffee and watching it all unfold, knowing I'd played my part perfectly. I leaned back on the couch, closing my eyes for a moment. The coffee was kicking in now, sharpening my thoughts. I needed to be ready for whatever Karen threw at me next. She might try to rally the HOA board, file a formal complaint, or even get the local cops involved. But none of that would matter. The FBI had jurisdiction, and they weren't about to let some suburban dictator mess with their operation. Karen was out of her depth, and the deeper she waded, the worse it would get for her. I opened my eyes and glanced at the clock. It was barely 7:30, and already the day felt like it had been going for hours. I stood up, stretched, and headed back to the kitchen to refill my coffee. As I poured, I caught sight of my reflection in the window, a guy in his 30s, slightly disheveled, with a faint smirk on his face. I looked like any other suburban homeowner, but I was something else entirely. And Karen was about to find out just how much she'd underestimated me. I took my coffee and walked to the back door, stepping out onto the small patio. The air was cool, the neighborhood quiet except for the distant hum of a lawnmower. I sat down on a lawn chair, letting the morning unfold around me. Somewhere out there, Karen was probably already plotting her next move, convinced she was on the verge of a major victory. Let her plot, I thought. Let her scheme. The more she pushed, the harder she'd fall. And when she did, I'd be right there, watching from the sidelines, with a fresh cup of coffee and a front row seat to the show. The morning after Karen's dramatic doorstep confrontation passed in a haze of uneasy quiet, but I knew better than to think she'd let it go. People like Karen don't just slink away after being told no, they double down, their egos too fragile to admit defeat. By noon, the neighborhood group chat was ablaze with her vague, ominous warnings about suspicious activities on my property, urging everyone to stay vigilant. I read her message while sipping my second cup of coffee, a wry grin spreading across my face. The irony was almost too rich. My garage, the source of her obsession, hadn't made a sound in days. The FBI's equipment was calibrated for ultra-low noise, the kind of precision that ensured even the faint hum of the servers stayed trapped behind reinforced, soundproof walls. Karen's paranoia was stretching further than I'd thought possible, and it was almost impressive how she could turn nothing into a full-blown conspiracy. I leaned back in my kitchen chair, scrolling through the flurry of responses in the chat. Neighbors were eating it up, tossing out wild theories about what I might be hiding. Asterisk, is he running a crypto mining operation? Maybe it's a grow house. I bet he's got a secret lab in there. Asterisk, I chuckled, shaking my head. If only they knew the truth, that my garage was a covert FBI recording studio, packed with encrypted systems and surveillance gear designed to capture wiretap evidence for a major criminal investigation. The idea of Karen stumbling into that reality was almost too delicious to contemplate. She thought she was the neighborhood's watchdog, but she was about to bark up a tree that would come crashing down on her. As the day wore on, I kept an eye on the neighborhood from my living room window. Karen was predictable, and I knew she wouldn't stop at a few cryptic messages. She'd be plotting something bigger, something she thought would prove her right and cement her status as the HOA's unchallenged ruler. Sure enough, by late afternoon, I spotted her across the street, huddled with a few of her most loyal HOA board members. They were trying to be discreet, whispering in low tones and casting furtive glances toward my house, but they were about as subtle as a marching band. One of them, a wiry guy named Carl who always wore a security shirt 3 sizes too tight, was waving around a pair of bolt cutters with a grin that screamed overconfidence. I laughed out loud, the sound echoing in the quiet room. They actually thought they were on some kind of covert mission, like they were the stars of a low-budget action flick. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that every inch of my property was under surveillance. Hidden cameras were tucked into the eaves, motion sensors were buried in the landscaping, and a silent alarm system was wired directly to the local FBI field office. Karen and her crew weren't just poking the bear, they were dousing themselves in barbecue sauce and waltzing into its den with a megaphone. I leaned closer to the window, watching as Carl gestured wildly with the bolt cutters, clearly trying to impress Karen with his tough guy routine. She nodded, her face a mask of determination, and I could almost hear her thoughts. Asterisk, he's hiding something, and I'm going to expose him. I'm going to be the hero. Asterisk. I shook my head and headed to my office, where a bank of monitors displayed the live feed from my security cameras. I zoomed in on Karen's little powwow, catching the gleam of the bolt cutters in the fading sunlight. They were planning something, and it didn't take a genius to guess what. Karen wasn't the type to wait for permission or follow protocol. She'd already demanded access to my garage and been denied, so now she was going to take matters into her own hands. I debated calling Agent Ramirez right then to give him a heads up, but a mischievous part of me wanted to let this play out. Karen was walking into a trap of her own making, and I had a front row seat. Why spoil the fun? I spent the rest of the evening going about my routine, keeping one eye on the camera feeds while I cooked dinner. The neighborhood settled into its usual rhythm, kids riding bikes, dogs barking, the occasional car pulling into a driveway. But I knew the calm was temporary. Karen was out there, scheming, and I could feel the tension building, like a storm on the horizon. Around 10 p.m., I dimmed the lights in the house and settled into my office chair, coffee in hand, the monitors casting a soft glow across the room. The camera feeds showed nothing unusual yet, just the quiet street and the occasional flicker of a porch light. But I wasn't fooled. Karen was coming, and she was bringing her bolt cutter-wielding sidekick with her. Sure enough, just after midnight, the feeds lit up with movement. 3 figures crept into frame, hunched over like they thought they were in a spy movie. Karen led the charge, her hair tucked under a dark scarf, like she was auditioning for a community theater production of Mission Impossible. Behind her were Carl and another HOA goon, a guy named Todd who always looked like he was one bad day away from a nervous breakdown. They carried a crowbar, the bolt cutters, and a cheap walkie-talkie set that looked like it had been bought at a discount store. I zoomed in, stifling a laugh as I watched them stumble over a garden gnome and nearly knock over my mailbox. They were about as stealthy as a herd of elephants, and I could already tell this was going to be a disaster for them. The silent alarm blipped on my screen. Asterisk perimeter breach detected. Activating level 1 protocols. Asterisk, I clicked to acknowledge, and across town, a silent alert pinged the FBI's emergency dispatch. Karen and her crew had no idea what they'd just triggered. On the feed, I watched as she pressed her ear to the garage door, her face contorted in exaggerated concentration. She whispered something to Carl, who nodded and brandished the bolt cutters like a knight wielding a sword. With a clumsy yank, he snipped the lock on the side gate, and the 3 of them slipped into the fenced utility area next to the garage. They crowded around the main door, struggling with the heavy industrial padlock I'd installed specifically to keep people like them out. I leaned forward, my coffee forgotten, as they fumbled and swore, their frustration growing with every failed attempt to break in. Carl kicked the door in a fit of anger, the sound muffled but audible through the camera's audio feed. Karen hissed at him to be quiet, her scarf slipping as she gestured wildly. Todd, meanwhile, was clutching the walkie-talkie like it was a lifeline, muttering something about maintaining radio silence. I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. These people were so far out of their depth it was almost sad. Almost. I zoomed in closer, catching the moment when Carl tried to wedge the crowbar under the door, only to slip and nearly impale himself. Karen's face was a study in fury, her lips moving in what I could only assume was a string of curses. They were so focused on their pathetic break-in attempt that they didn't notice the faint hum of engines approaching from both ends of the street. And then, without warning, the night exploded into chaos. Red and blue lights flooded the darkness, bathing my property in a strobe-like glow. Black SUVs roared up from both directions, tires screeching as they boxed in the street. Doors flew open, and federal agents poured out, moving with the kind of precision that only comes from years of training. They surrounded the garage in seconds, their voices sharp and commanding as they barked orders that echoed across the sleeping neighborhood. Hands up. Drop your tools. get on the ground." Karen let out a scream that could have woken the dead, dropping the crowbar like it was on fire. Carl tripped over his own feet and face-planted into a flower bed, the bolt cutters skidding across the pavement. Todd froze, his hands shooting into the air, the walkie-talkie dangling uselessly from his wrist like a broken toy. I stood up from my chair, stretching leisurely as I sipped my coffee. The monitors showed the agents moving in, their movements swift and controlled. One of them zip-tied Karen's wrists behind her back while she shrieked about her rights as HOA president. Another agent helped Carl to his feet, brushing dirt off his face with a look of thinly veiled amusement. Todd was babbling incoherently, trying to explain that he was just following orders. I strolled to the front door, opening it just in time to catch the full spectacle unfolding on my lawn. Karen was being led to an SUV, her scarf now hanging around her neck like a noose, her face a perfect blend of terror and indignation. She caught sight of me and froze, her eyes narrowing as if she could will me into submission with sheer hatred. "You," she spat, struggling against the agent's grip. "You're behind this. I know you're hiding something illegal in there." I raised my coffee cup in a mock toast, my smile wide and unapologetic. "Have a nice night, Karen," I said, my voice dripping with calm amusement. The agent escorting her gave me a subtle nod, his expression professional but tinged with a hint of respect. "Thank you for your cooperation, sir," he said. "We've got it from here." I nodded back, hiding my grin behind the rim of my cup. In the distance, Karen's voice rose to a high-pitched wail, a sound that was quickly becoming the neighborhood's unofficial soundtrack. "This is outrageous. I'm the HOA president. I have rights." The agents ignored her, loading her and her cronies into the SUVs with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. As the vehicles pulled away, their lights fading into the night, I closed the door and returned to my office, settling back into my chair to review the footage. The cameras had captured everything, every clumsy step, every whispered argument, every moment of Karen's spectacular failure. Somewhere in the FBI's field office, Agent Ramirez was probably watching the same feed, laughing his ass off. I leaned back, savoring the moment. Karen had thought she was going to catch me red-handed, expose me as some kind of criminal mastermind. Instead, she'd walked straight into the lion's mouth, and the jaws were snapping shut. But this wasn't the end, not by a long shot. Karen was too stubborn, too delusional to admit defeat. Even now, I knew she was probably sitting in the back of that SUV, plotting her next move, convincing herself she could still come out on top. She didn't realize that every step she took was being watched. Every word she said was being recorded. The FBI wasn't just dealing with a nosy HOA president. They were building a case, and Karen was handing them evidence on a silver platter. I spent the next hour downloading the footage, encrypting it, and sending it to Ramirez with a brief note. * Karen tried to play spy. Didn't end well. Let me know if you need anything else. * I hit send and leaned back, the adrenaline of the night starting to fade. The house was quiet again, the only sound the soft hum of the monitors. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up, lights flicking on as curious neighbors peeked out to see what all the commotion was about. By morning, the group chat would be a war zone, with Karen's failed break-in fueling gossip for weeks. I could already imagine the memes, the snarky comments, the inevitable calls for her to step down as HOA president. But I knew Karen wouldn't go quietly. She'd fight, she'd scheme, and she'd drag this out until she had no moves left. I stood up and stretched, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m., but I was too wired to sleep. I grabbed my coffee, cold now, but I didn't care, and headed to the garage to check on the equipment. The door slid open silently, revealing the dimly lit interior. Rows of monitors lined one wall, their screens dark but ready to spring to life at a moment's notice. Soundproof panels covered every surface, giving the room a muffled, almost otherworldly feel. In the center, a cluster of servers hummed softly, their lights blinking in a steady rhythm. This was the heart of the operation, the nerve center that had kept me busy for months. Every wire, every connection, every piece of tech had been carefully chosen to ensure the FBI's investigation stayed on track. And now, thanks to Karen, it was also the stage for her downfall. I ran a quick diagnostic, confirming that everything was still secure. The cameras hadn't missed a thing, and the alarms had worked flawlessly. I couldn't help but smile as I thought about Karen's face when those SUVs rolled up. She'd probably thought she was one step away from uncovering the scandal of the century. Instead, she tripped over her own ego and landed in federal custody. I closed the garage door and headed back inside, locking up for the night. As I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Karen wasn't done, not yet. She'd come back, more desperate, more reckless, and when she did, I'd be ready. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. I opened my blinds to find half a dozen neighbors lingering on the sidewalk, pretending to walk their dogs or check their mailboxes while stealing glances at my house. A few cars slowed as they passed, their passengers craning their necks for a better look. The group chat was a mess, with messages piling up faster than I could read them. Asterisk, did you see the lights last night? What happened at his place? I heard Karen got arrested. Asterisk, I scrolled through, sipping my coffee and marveling at how quickly the story had spread. Karen's midnight escapade had gone off like a bomb, and the fallout was just getting started. I spent the morning fielding texts from curious neighbors, most of whom were fishing for details I had no intention of sharing. Asterisk, what's in your garage? Why was the FBI here? Are you in trouble? Asterisk, I responded with vague, non-committal answers, letting their imaginations run wild. The less I said, the more they speculated, and I was happy to let them chase their own tails. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on Karen's house, which was suspiciously quiet. No neon pink blazer, no clipboard, no sign of her usual morning patrol. I figured she was either licking her wounds or plotting her next move, and I was betting on the latter. By afternoon, I got a call from Agent Ramirez. His voice was calm but laced with amusement as he filled me in. Karen and her crew had been released on bail, but they were facing serious charges: trespassing, attempted breaking and entering, and possession of burglary tools. The FBI was still reviewing the footage, but Ramirez was confident they had enough to make the charges stick. She's already trying to spin it, he said, chuckling. Says she was protecting the community, and you're some kind of criminal mastermind. I don't think she realizes how deep she's in it. I laughed, leaning back in my chair. Let her talk, I said. She's just digging her own grave. Ramirez agreed, promising to keep me posted. As I hung up, I glanced out the window again. The neighbors were still lurking, their curiosity showing no signs of fading. I knew Karen would be back, and when she came, she'd be more desperate than ever. She'd probably try to rally the HOA, maybe even stage another stunt to prove I was up to no good. But every move she made was another nail in her coffin. The FBI was watching, the cameras were rolling, and I was ready for whatever she threw at me next. I stood up and headed to the kitchen, pouring myself a fresh cup of coffee. The day was young and the game was far from over. Karen had thought she could outsmart me, but she was playing chess with a grandmaster while she was still learning checkers. Let her scheme, let her plot, let her think she had the upper hand. The truth was, she'd already lost, she just didn't know it yet. And when the final blow came, I'd be right there, coffee in hand, watching her empire crumble. The fallout from Karen's botched midnight break-in was like a wildfire tearing through the neighborhood, leaving chaos and gossip in its wake. By sunrise, the street was buzzing with whispers and sidelong glances, neighbors clustering on their porches to dissect the night's drama. The group chat had exploded into a frenzy of speculation, with messages piling up faster than anyone could read. Asterisk, Karen got arrested. The FBI was at his house. What's in that garage? Asterisk, I sipped my coffee, scrolling through the chaos with a smirk. The truth was so much wilder than their theories. but I wasn't about to spill the beans. Let them stew in their curiosity. It was more fun that way. Karen had tried to play hero and ended up the villain, and now the whole neighborhood was watching her empire of clipboard tyranny start to crack. I spent the morning playing the part of the oblivious homeowner, mowing the lawn and waving cheerfully at the gawkers who slowed their cars to stare. Every time I raised a hand, a few neighbors ducked behind bushes or pretended to check their phones, like they were in a badly scripted spy movie. It was almost poetic, the way Karen's obsession with my garage had turned her into the neighborhood's biggest spectacle. Her neon pink blazer was nowhere to be seen, her house dark and silent across the street. I figured she was either licking her wounds or plotting her next move, and knowing Karen, it was definitely the latter. She wasn't the type to go down without a fight, no matter how deep the hole she dug. By noon, the news vans started circling, their antennas poking up like vultures sniffing out a story. Local headlines were already screaming about the HOA president arrested in federal sting, and clips of Karen's handcuffed meltdown were going viral. One particularly glorious video of her face planting into my flower bed during her escape attempt had racked up 500,000 views, complete with a meme caption, *, when your HOA duties get you a one-way ticket to jail. *, I laughed out loud, saving the link to show Agent Ramirez later. Karen's reign of terror was unraveling faster than a cheap sweater, and I was here for every glorious second of it. But Karen wasn't done, not yet. Around mid-afternoon, I caught sight of her lurking at the corner of the street, her hair a mess and her trademark clipboard clutched like a lifeline. She was wearing oversized sunglasses that screamed, "I'm hiding," which, naturally, made everyone stare harder. I watched from my living room, the security camera feeds pulled up on my laptop, as she crept along the sidewalk, pretending to admire the flowers while snapping covert photos of my house with her phone. She wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore, her desperation rolling off her in waves. I could practically hear her thoughts. If I can just find something, anything, I can still turn this around. Poor Karen. She didn't realize that every move she made was being recorded, not just by my cameras, but by the FBI, who'd opened an obstruction investigation the moment she'd tried to break into my garage. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee and zooming in on the feed. Karen's face was a study in grim determination, her lips pursed as she typed furiously on her phone, probably drafting another inflammatory post for the group chat. She thought she could manufacture enough outrage to dodge the consequences, maybe rally her HOA loyalists to her cause. But reality wasn't on her side. The FBI had her on tape, trespassing, wielding burglary tools, screaming about her rights as the agents cuffed her. And now, with every sneaky photo she took, she was adding fuel to the fire. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. As evening fell, I got a text from my buddy Sam, a longtime neighbor and fellow Karen hater who lived 2 streets over. He'd been at the HOA's emergency meeting that Karen had called, and his play-by-play was pure gold. Apparently, Karen had gathered her most loyal board members in a desperate bid to salvage her reputation. She'd spun a wild tale about acting in good faith based on credible community concerns, insisting she'd been protecting the neighborhood from my supposed criminal activities. Her new plan? Stage another complaint, this time claiming my garage was running an illegal broadcast center that was jamming emergency services. I burst out laughing when I read that. The idea was so absurd it could have been ripped from a bad sci-fi flick. My equipment didn't even operate on those wavelengths, and Karen had no clue how deep she was sinking. Sam's texts kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. Karen had apparently waved her clipboard like a battle flag, rallying her cronies with promises of vindication. But the cracks were showing, some board members were starting to waver, their loyalty crumbling under the weight of her increasingly unhinged schemes. One guy, Todd, had even tried to distance himself, muttering that he'd never wanted to break in and had only gone along because Karen threatened him with fines. It was like watching a sinking ship, with rats scrambling for the lifeboats. I texted Sam back, asterisk, keep me posted. This is better than Netflix, asterisk. I knew Karen's latest plan was doomed, but I also knew she wouldn't stop. Her ego was too big, her need to be right too consuming. So when Sam texted me 2 nights later, just after 11 p.m., I wasn't surprised to hear she was at it again. This time, Karen and her inner circle had donned black clothes like a group of teenagers about to TP a house. They'd armed themselves with a cheap radio scanner, a borrowed police radio, and a handheld signal jammer they'd probably bought from some sketchy online store. Their mission, according to Sam's intel, was to prove my garage was interfering with emergency frequencies. I shook my head, pulling up the camera feeds and settling in with a cup of chamomile tea. This was going to be good. The feeds lit up as Karen and her crew crept onto my property, moving with the grace of a herd of drunk rhinos. Karen was in the lead, her scarf slipping as she waved the scanner around like she expected to catch secret government signals leaking from my walls. Carl was fiddling with the signal jammer, which immediately started malfunctioning, spitting out static bursts that made him jump. Todd trailed behind, clutching the police radio and looking like he was regretting every life choice that had led him to this moment. I zoomed in, catching Karen's whispered orders loud enough to wake the neighbors as she pointed at the garage door. The jammer let out a high-pitched shriek, and Carl nearly dropped it, earning a furious glare from Karen. I stifled a laugh, my tea nearly spilling. These people were a walking disaster. They positioned themselves right outside the garage, waving the scanner around in a pathetic attempt to pick up something incriminating. What they didn't know was that they'd just triggered a secondary motion sensor, a faint click echoing through the darkness as my hidden cameras lit them up with infrared. They were trespassing again, this time with illegal tech in tow, and the FBI was already on the move. I watched as Karen barked more orders, her desperation palpable. She was so convinced she was on the verge of a breakthrough, so sure she'd catch me red-handed. Instead, she was about to catch a one-way ticket to deeper trouble. Within minutes, the street lit up with the now familiar glow of red and blue lights. Unmarked SUVs rolled in silently, then erupted into action, sirens blaring and floodlights turning night into day. Federal agents swept onto the property, their voices sharp as they ordered Karen and her crew to drop their equipment and get on the ground. Karen let out her signature scream, the sound practically a neighborhood anthem by now. She tried to run, but tripped over one of my solar driveway lights, sprawling across the grass in a tangle of limbs and scarf. Carl was tackled mid-step, his jammer skidding across the pavement. Todd dropped the police radio and threw his hands up, babbling about how he was just holding it for a friend. I stepped outside, leaning against the doorframe with my tea in hand, watching the chaos unfold. One agent picked up the jammer between 2 gloved fingers, shaking his head in disbelief. Another was cuffing Karen, who was still shrieking about her rights and how I was the real criminal. Agent Ramirez approached me, his face a mix of professionalism and barely contained amusement. Looks like your HOA just upgraded from trespassing to possession of illegal surveillance equipment, he said dryly. Congrats. They're going for the felony combo. I chuckled, raising my tea in a mock toast. Always happy to help, Agent. Karen caught our exchange and practically vibrated with rage, her cuffed hands flailing as she pointed at me. He's the criminal. He's running an illegal operation. I'm protecting this community. Ramirez didn't even glance at her, his voice calm but cutting. Ma'am, you're under arrest for multiple felonies, including unlawful surveillance, trespassing, and tampering with federal property. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. Karen's jaw dropped, her face a mask of shock and fury. She opened and closed her mouth like a broken puppet, her brain clearly struggling to process the reality crashing down around her. As the agents loaded her and her crew into the SUVs, I gave a little wave to the cameras, knowing my FBI colleagues were probably howling with laughter back at the field office. Karen had wanted to be the hero, the one who exposed my criminal empire. Instead, she turned herself into the prime suspect in a federal investigation, all because she couldn't mind her own business. The SUVs pulled away, their lights fading into the night, and I headed back inside, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the monitors. I saved the footage, encrypted it, and sent it to Ramirez with a note. * round 2 in the books. Let me know when she tries for the hat trick. *. The next morning, the neighborhood was a circus. News vans were parked bumper to bumper, reporters jostling for shots of my house while neighbors spilled onto their lawns, coffee in hand, to watch the spectacle. The group chat was a war zone, with residents demanding answers and tossing out theories wilder than the last. *. Is he a spy? A drug lord? Why does the FBI keep showing up? *. I ignored the flood of texts, asking for details, responding only with a shrug emoji. Let them wonder. The truth was crazier than anything they could dream up, and I wasn't about to ruin the fun. Around noon, Ramirez showed up at my door, flanked by 2 other agents who looked like they'd stepped out of a Hollywood blockbuster. He got straight to the point, his voice calm but firm. We need you for a full debriefing, and we thought it'd be useful to have you at the HOA board meeting this afternoon. Your president's got some explaining to do. His mouth twitched, like he was fighting a grin. I agreed immediately, sensing this was going to be a show worth watching. Half an hour later, we rolled up to the neighborhood clubhouse, the same place where Karen had once lorded over HOA meetings, handing out fines for unapproved flower pots and unsightly lawn gnomes. Now it was packed with stone-faced agents and a handful of trembling board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The air was thick with tension, the room so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Karen was brought in separately, still in cuffs, her face pale and drawn. She refused to look at me, her eyes fixed on the stack of legal documents spread across the table. Ramirez stood at the front, his voice cold and precise. We have evidence that members of this HOA, under Miss Karen's leadership, have engaged in unlawful surveillance, trespassing, tampering with federal property, and obstruction of an ongoing federal investigation. He paused, letting the words sink in. There were gasps, a few muttered curses, and one dramatic squeak from the woman who ran the garden committee. Karen exploded, her voice echoing off the walls. This is ridiculous. I was protecting the community. He's the criminal. She jabbed a shaking finger at me, her eyes wild with fury. Ramirez didn't flinch. He slid a folder across the table, its contents spilling out like a death sentence. Photos, surveillance footage, signed warrants, a detailed timeline of my legal cooperation with the FBI. Karen snatched it up, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages, her face growing paler with every damning piece of evidence. The room watched in stunned silence as her loyalists began to crack. Todd blurted out that he'd never wanted to break in, that Karen had coerced him. Linda, the garden lady, chimed in, claiming she'd been threatened with fines. It was chaos, a sinking ship with everyone scrambling to save themselves. Ramirez let the room descend into pandemonium for a moment before raising a hand for silence. Here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice cutting through the noise. Some of you will face charges, depending on your involvement. Others will be investigated. But make no mistake, there will be consequences. He turned to Karen, his gaze icy. And you, Miss Karen, are facing multiple felony charges that will almost certainly mean prison time. The room went silent, save for a low, desperate whimper from Karen. She looked around, searching for allies, but found only cold glares from the neighbors she'd once ruled. Her empire was gone, and she was utterly alone. As the agents gathered their materials, Ramirez shook my hand, his grip firm. Thanks for your cooperation, he said. You've been a hell of a help. I nodded, a deep satisfaction settling in my chest. For over a year, I'd worked quietly, helping the FBI dismantle a criminal network while enduring Karen's petty harassment. Now, her stupidity had exposed her corruption and brought her HOA crashing down. As I left the clubhouse, the sun bright overhead, I caught a few hesitant nods from neighbors. Word was spreading, and by evening, the full story would be out. Karen's reign was over, and I'd helped make it happen. Back home, I sat on the porch, a glass of lemonade in hand, watching the sunset. A moving truck was already pulling up to Karen's house, its engine rumbling in the quiet street. Whether she'd sold it or had it seized, I didn't care. The neighborhood was free, and I'd played my part. But I knew the fallout was just beginning. Karen's legacy of chaos would linger, and I'd be ready for whatever came next, coffee in hand, cameras rolling, and a smile on my face. The morning after Karen's second arrest dawned bright and crisp, the kind of day that felt like a fresh start. The neighborhood was alive in a way it hadn't been in years, as if someone had lifted a heavy curtain and let the sunlight pour in. Kids rode their bikes down the street, laughing without the usual tension that had hung over the place like a fog. Neighbors waved at each other, their smiles genuine instead of strained. Even the dogs seemed to bark with a little more joy. Karen's reign of terror was officially over, and the air was lighter for it. I sat on my porch, sipping coffee and watching the world wake up, a quiet satisfaction settling in my chest. This was what freedom looked like, not just from Karen, but from the fear she'd wielded like a sledgehammer. The news trucks were still circling, their cameras hungry for any scrap of the scandal that had rocked our little corner of suburbia. Headlines screamed across every local channel and social media feed. HOA presidents fall from grace. Federal charges in bizarre break and plot. Karen's face was everywhere, frozen in that viral moment of her sprawling across my lawn. Scarf askew and dignity in tatters. The memes were relentless. One genius had photoshopped her into a cartoon villain, complete with a clipboard labeled "Evil Plans." I saved that one for Agent Ramirez, knowing he'd get a kick out of it. The neighborhood was eating it up, their group chat a non-stop parade of snark and glee. For once, the gossip wasn't tearing anyone down. It was building something new, a shared sense of triumph over a tyrant. I spent the morning tidying up the garage, the infamous heart of the drama. The FBI had done a thorough sweep after Karen's second stunt, securing this sensitive equipment and ensuring her bumbling hadn't compromised the operation. The servers still hummed softly, their lights blinking in a steady rhythm, a reminder of the bigger mission I'd been part of for over a year. Every wire, every soundproof panel, every encrypted system had been my domain, a covert lifeline for the FBI's fight against a sprawling criminal network. Karen had thought she was exposing a scandal, but all she'd done was shine a spotlight on her own corruption. I ran a quick diagnostic, confirmed everything was still airtight, and locked the door behind me. The garage was no longer just a secret, it was a legend. By midday, the HOA was in full meltdown. 3 board members resigned in a flurry of hastily written emails, citing personal reasons and family commitments. One even tried to scrub his entire digital footprint, deleting old posts and emails like that would erase his role in Karen's schemes. Too late, buddy. The FBI had already backed everything up. An emergency meeting was called for that evening, open to all residents, and the turnout was massive. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only, with neighbors spilling out onto the lawn. I slipped in near the back, coffee in hand, ready to watch the final act of this absurd drama unfold. The remaining board members stumbled through apologies that landed like wet paper towels. Linda, the garden committee lady, tried to pin everything on Karen, painting herself as a helpless victim bullied into compliance. Todd, still sweating from his brush with federal cuffs, muttered about being misled and acting on bad information. The residents weren't buying it. One after another, they stood up, their voices sharp with years of pent-up frustration. A woman in a tracksuit waved a binder full of violation notices, slamming it on the table for emphasis. 5 years of this nonsense, she shouted. Fines for my mailbox, my shrubs, my freaking welcome mat. Enough. The room erupted in cheers, a raw, cathartic release of anger that had been simmering too long. The knockout punch came when Agent Ramirez took the floor, his badge gleaming around his neck. He didn't raise his voice, but every word carried the weight of authority. "The FBI's investigation isn't limited to Miss Karen," he said, his gaze sweeping the room. "If any HOA members knowingly participated in illegal activities, there will be consequences." The silence was deafening. A few board members turned visibly pale, and one guy bolted for the door, leaving his chair spinning. Ramirez dropped the final bomb. He recommended dissolving the current HOA leadership and holding new elections under federal supervision. The room exploded into chaos, cheers, gasps, and a few shouted insults aimed at the cowering board. Karen's legacy was crumbling, and the neighborhood was ready to bury it. As the meeting broke up, people spilled outside, clustering in small groups to argue and whisper. A few approached me, their voices low with gratitude. "Thanks for standing up to her," one woman said, her eyes bright. "We were too scared to do it ourselves." Another guy, a retiree who'd once gotten a fine for his unauthorized birdhouse, clapped me on the shoulder. "You should run for the board," he said. I smiled and shook my head. "Not my thing," I replied. "I've done my part." I had no interest in becoming the next Karen, clipboard or not. My job was to keep the shadows clean, not to stand in the spotlight. Across the street, Karen's house sat dark, a "for sale by owner" sign hammered into the lawn. Rumor had it she was planning to skip town, hoping to outrun the scandal. Good luck with that. Federal charges don't vanish with a change of address. Her legal proceedings were moving fast, and without the HOA to shield her, her options were dwindling. Her lawyer, looking like he'd aged a decade in a week, negotiated a plea deal. Hefty fines, thousands of hours of community service, and a permanent ban from any leadership role in any residential association or public office. It was a spectacular fall, the kind that would be whispered about for years. Photos of Karen in an orange vest, picking up trash in a neighboring county, were already circulating online, her face a mask of humiliation as passers-by snapped pictures. Karma didn't just knock, it kicked the door down. To celebrate the end of the Karen saga, the neighborhood threw a block party that was less a gathering and more a full-blown festival. I offered my backyard and the now legendary garage as the main venue, and by noon, the street was alive with food trucks, live music, and kids running wild with face paint. Neighbors brought lawn chairs, coolers, and homemade dishes, their laughter mingling with the strum of a local band. The mood was electric, a community unshackled from fear and ready to rebuild. I set up a karaoke machine in the garage, and people lined up to belt out tunes, marveling at the equipment that had sparked so much chaos. "This is what she was freaking out about," one guy laughed, eyeing the servers. "Man, she's dumber than I thought." Agent Ramirez and a few off-duty agents swung by, bringing a plaque engraved with a tongue-in-cheek nod, in recognition of outstanding service in HOA counterintelligence. The crowd roared as Ramirez presented it with mock formality, and someone snapped a photo that I later framed for my living room. It was a reminder that sometimes the best victories come from standing your ground and letting the truth do the work. As the sun set, we hung a piñata shaped like a giant clipboard from a tree, and neighbors took turns whacking it, cheering as candy and fake violation notices spilled out. It was the perfect end to a long, ridiculous saga. Later, as the fire pit glowed and the crowd thinned, I stood near the grill, flipping burgers and soaking in the scene. The neighborhood felt alive, not just surviving but thriving. For months, fear had ruled this place, fear of fines, of Karen's wrath, of stepping out of line. Now, there was music, laughter, and the smell of grilled food in the air. People were talking, really talking, forging connections that hadn't existed under Karen's iron grip. It was a transformation I hadn't expected, but was proud to have helped spark. A few days later, a city official named Mr. Delaney pulled up in a sleek SUV. Over coffee on my porch, he got straight to the point. After the Karen debacle, The city wanted a civilian liaison to keep an eye on community affairs, someone who knew the stakes and the law. "You're the guy," he said, offering me the role. I thought it over for about 2 seconds before saying yes. Who better to spot a rising tyrant than the man who'd already taken one down? The gig came with a small ceremony at City Hall, nothing fancy, just a certificate and a few speeches, but it meant something. As I stood there, smiling for the local paper, I caught sight of neighbors in the crowd, clapping and cheering. Some had once backed Karen, too afraid to question her. Now, they were free, and I felt a quiet pride knowing I'd helped make that happen. The block party became an annual tradition, a reminder of how far we'd come. Each year, the garage was the star, a symbol of resilience and the absurdity of Karen's downfall. People still told stories about her, how she'd screamed about her rights, how she'd tripped over a solar light, how she'd thought she could outsmart the FBI. Her name became a punchline, a cautionary tale whispered in jest. The new HOA, elected under federal oversight, was a breath of fresh air, focused on community over control. No more fines for mailbox colors or unsightly lawn gnomes. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and we guarded it fiercely. As I sat on my porch one evening, months later, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold, I thought about how it all started. A knock on my door, a neon pink blazer, and a woman too stubborn to back down. Karen had seen me as a threat, and she wasn't wrong. But she'd underestimated the quiet guy with the locked garage, the one who'd spent a year building a covert operation under her nose. She'd thought she could control the narrative, bend the neighborhood to her will. Instead, she'd ignited a rebellion, forging a stronger community from the ashes of her tyranny. The plaque from the FBI hung near my front door, a quiet testament to the chaos and the victory. I hadn't set out to be a hero or a symbol, just a guy doing his job, keeping his head down and refusing to bow to a bully. But life has a way of turning small stands into seismic shifts. Karen's fall wasn't just her defeat. It was our triumph, a reminder that no one rules through fear forever. The neighborhood was alive, vibrant, and free, and all it had taken was one entitled woman's obsession and a garage full of secrets. As the last light faded, I raised my coffee cup to the empty street, a silent toast to the truth and the sweet, hard-won peace it had brought. Here's to the quiet rebels, the ones who stand firm and let the world catch up. We're the ones who change everything.